No one in that police station knew that the quiet man walking through the door that morning would change their careers forever. What began as a normal day filled with jokes and coffee would soon expose secrets, destroy arrogance, and force an entire department to face the truth they had tried to ignore for years. It was a sticky, humid Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson stepped out of his old sedan in the center of Blue Ridge. The small North Carolina city rested calmly between soft rolling hills, appearing peaceful on the surface. The air was thick and the sun had already begun to press down on the pavement. Richard stood for a moment, letting the heat settle, his eyes scanning the surroundings carefully. He wore a faded plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested power or authority. No badge on display, no polished shoes, no sharp suit. He looked like an ordinary man running errands before work. That was exactly the point. Richard Nelson had spent more than 20 years working his way through the ranks of law enforcement. He had earned respect the hard way through long nights, dangerous calls, and years of quiet leadership. But today, he wanted no special treatment. As a black man stepping into a leadership position in a department surrounded by whispered rumors and unresolved complaints, he wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. He did not believe in staged welcomes or rehearsed behavior. He believed that real character showed itself when people thought no one important was watching. That was why he chose to arrive early and unannounced, dressed like someone who did not matter. The precinct parking lot buzzed with activity. Patrol cars rolled in and out. Officers stood in small groups, laughing loudly, sharing stories, and finishing their coffee. Some leaned against their cars while others hurried toward the entrance. Richard walked slowly, his posture relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. A few officers glanced at him briefly, their eyes lingering for just a second longer than usual. Then they looked away, dismissing him as unimportant. No one greeted him, no one asked who he was. That did not surprise him. His appointment as the new police chief had only been announced a few days earlier. Even then, he had requested that no photographs be shared and no formal introduction be made until later that morning. He wanted his first impression to be honest. He adjusted the brim of his cap and took a slow breath. The weight of the job pressed on him, heavier than the heat. He knew what this role would bring: pushback. Anger, resistance, maybe even hatred. Still, he had faced worse challenges before. But this department, with its quiet smiles and loud rumors, would test him in ways he had not yet experienced. As he approached the building, faint laughter drifted through the walls. The sound was casual, careless. Richard pushed open the side door and stepped inside without anyone noticing. The smell of stale coffee and old paper filled the air. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the polished tile floors. Richard walked slowly down the hallway, his eyes taking in every detail. Officers stood near desks, flipping through reports or chatting loudly. Phones rang. Chairs scraped against the floor. No one acknowledged him. He passed bulletin boards covered in outdated notices. He noticed jokes taped near desks that should not have been there. He observed body language, tone, and expressions. Some officers appeared tired. Others looked too comfortable. A few seemed alert, but most paid him no attention at all. Then a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you!" Richard stopped and turned calmly. A white officer was walking toward him with a lazy stride and a smug grin stretched across his face. His badge read Officer Daniels. A small group of officers leaned nearby, watching closely, already entertained, lost or something. Daniels said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "This isn't a shelter." A few chuckles followed. Richard felt the words hit him hard, but he kept his expression neutral. He stood still, meeting the officer's eyes without flinching. "You need to take that mess somewhere else," Daniels added, glancing at Richard's clothes with clear disgust. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Daniels stepped closer, raising his voice so everyone nearby could hear. "Didn't you hear me?" He said, "Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter erupted from the group behind him. One officer shook his head as if enjoying a familiar routine. Another leaned forward, clearly expecting something worse. Richard's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. He considered revealing who he was right then, ending it immediately, but something told him to wait, to let the moment unfold naturally. Before he could decide, Daniels leaned in even closer, his face inches away, breath hot and sharp. Then, without warning, Daniels spat directly into Richard's face. Time seemed to freeze. The warm spit slid slowly down Richard's cheek. The hallway went silent for half a second, then laughter exploded. One officer slapped the desk, bending over as he laughed. Another muttered something under his breath about putting people in their place. Richard's heart pounded, but he did not react the way they expected. He did not shout. He did not raise his hands. He did not threaten anyone. Instead, he reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out a clean handkerchief. Every movement was deliberate, calm, controlled. He wiped his face carefully and folded the cloth before slipping it back into his pocket. Then he looked directly at Daniels. His voice was steady, quiet, but sharp. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniels smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." More laughter followed, louder this time. Richard said nothing else. He turned slowly and walked away down the hall. His footsteps echoed softly against the tile. Behind him, the laughter faded, replaced by uneasy murmurs. A moment later, the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately." Richard did not change his pace. He continued walking, now toward the main office. The moment had arrived. Inside the briefing room, officers filled the space with noise and movement. Some sipped coffee, others joked quietly, a few checked their phones. Daniels leaned casually against the wall, still wearing a satisfied expression. At the front stood Captain Harris, a stocky man with a thick gray mustache. He raised his hand. "All right, settle down," he said. "We've got an important introduction today." The room slowly quieted. Curiosity spread across faces. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month." Harris continued. "We've been waiting for his replacement. I'm pleased to introduce our new chief, a man with a long record of leadership and a clear vision for this department." Several heads turned toward the door. The room went silent as Richard stepped forward. He now carried a folder marked with the department's official seal. His calm steps echoed as he walked to the front. The sight of him drained the color from Daniel's face. Whispers spread rapidly. Richard placed the folder on the podium and looked out at the room. "Good morning," he said evenly. "My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." No one moved. The air felt heavy. The silence in the briefing room felt thick and uncomfortable, like the air before a storm. Officers stared at Richard as if they were unsure whether to breathe. Some looked shocked. Others looked confused. A few slowly lowered their eyes, already sensing trouble. Officer Daniels no longer leaned casually against the wall. His confident posture had collapsed. His face drained of color, then flushed red as realization crashed into him. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Richard rested both hands on the podium and scanned the room calmly. His eyes moved from face to face. He took his time. He wanted them to feel the moment. "When I arrived here this morning," Richard said slowly, "I came in plain clothes for a reason." A quiet murmur moved through the room. "I wanted to see this department without filters," he continued. "No warnings, no performances, no prepared behavior." Captain Harris shifted slightly but said nothing. In a very short amount of time, Richard said, "I saw things that should never exist in a place like this." He raised one hand slightly, signaling for silence as a few officers began to whisper. "What I witnessed was not just unprofessional," he said. "It was disturbing." No one spoke. "Let me be very clear," Richard continued. "The culture that has been allowed to grow here ends today." Officer Daniels stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tightly. Respect is not optional, Richard said firmly. It is the foundation of this job. Without it, we fail each other, and worse, we fail the people we are sworn to protect. Richard paused, letting his words sink in. This morning, he continued, some of you laughed while a man was publicly humiliated. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. You treated it like entertainment. Richard said, like a joke. He stepped away from the podium and walked slowly toward the rows of chairs. That man could have been anyone, he said, a civilian asking for help, a father, a visitor, a neighbor. His voice stayed calm, but it carried weight. Every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity, Richard said. Badge or no badge, no one dared interrupt him. Richard stopped walking and looked directly at the group where Daniel stood. Change is not easy, he said, but there will be zero tolerance for behavior that dehumanizes others. The room felt smaller. Hotter, he took a few more steps forward. As long as I am chief, Richard said, this department will operate with integrity, accountability, and respect. Several officers avoided his eyes. Richard stopped just a few feet from Officer Daniels. Officer Daniels, he said. Daniels flinched. You represent everything that is broken here. Richard continued, locking eyes with him. When you spat in my face, you did not just disrespect me. Daniels swallowed hard. You disrespected the badge, Richard said. You disrespected the oath, and you disrespected the community we serve. Chief, Daniels stammered, I didn't know who you were. Richard did not raise his voice. That is exactly the problem, he replied. You didn't care to know. The room remained silent. You made an assumption. Richard said, you assumed the man in front of you did not matter. He shook his head slowly. That attitude is why trust has been broken between this department and the people it serves. Daniel's shoulders slumped. What I witnessed today, Richard continued, was not a single mistake. It was a reflection of a culture where bullying and prejudice are tolerated. Richard turned back toward the podium. That ends now, he said. He placed his hands on the podium once more. I have spent my entire career fighting for justice, Richard said, not just on the streets, but inside departments exactly like this one. He took a breath. Change will not happen overnight, he continued, but while I am chief it will happen. He turned slightly toward Captain Harris. Effective immediately, Richard said. Officer Daniels is suspended pending a full internal investigation. Gasps spread across the room. Daniel's face burned red. He stared at the floor, unable to look at anyone. And let me be clear, Richard added, this is not a warning. His eyes swept across the room. This is the beginning. No one moved. This is not about revenge, Richard said. It is about standards. He leaned forward slightly. If you are not willing to meet those standards, he said, this is not the place for you. Silence filled the room. But if you are willing to do better, Richard continued, if you are willing to rebuild trust and serve with honor, then we will move forward together. He straightened up. Just understand this, Richard said. I will hold every single one of you accountable. The meeting ended without applause, without chatter. Officers stood slowly and filed out, avoiding eye contact. The laughter that once filled the halls was gone. Daniel stormed out first, his pride shattered. Others followed more slowly. Some looked ashamed, some thoughtful, some afraid. Richard remained standing for a moment after the room emptied. He exhaled quietly. Back in his office, Richard closed the door and sat down heavily at his desk. The room was simple, bare walls, a clean desk, no personal items yet. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment. He knew this was only the beginning. Years of toxic behavior would not disappear overnight. Some officers would resist, some would leave, others would be exposed, but he had not come to Blue Ridge to be liked. He had come to make a difference. The phone rang. Chief, Captain Harris said carefully, I just wanted to say you handled that better than most would have. Thank you, Richard replied, but the real work starts now. I want a full report on Daniels, Richard continued. Complaints, records, everything on my desk by tomorrow. You got it, Harris said, and Chief, I think you got through to them. Richard hung up the phone and allowed himself a brief smile before turning back to his paperwork. Outside his office, the station felt different, quieter, heavier, and change had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere inside the Blue Ridge police station changed in ways that could be felt without a single word being spoken. The loud laughter that once echoed through the halls faded into cautious silence. Conversations became quieter. Jokes disappeared. Officers began to watch themselves, not because they feared punishment, but because something deeper had been shaken. Richard noticed everything. He arrived early each morning and stayed late into the evening. Sometimes he wore a suit, other times he dressed simply again, walking through the station without announcing himself. He listened more than he spoke. He watched how officers interacted with civilians at the front desk. He observed how reports were written. He paid attention to how complaints were handled. Small things stood out. Officers who once ignored civilians now looked up and made eye contact. Some greeted people politely, though awkwardly at first. Others struggled to adjust, their frustration showing in stiff movements and forced smiles. A few officers kept their distance, clearly unhappy with the new direction. Richard expected that. Change always revealed who was willing to grow and who was not. Captain Harris kept his word. By the next day, Richard's desk was covered in files related to Officer Daniels. Complaints, warnings, notes that had been ignored or quietly dismissed. Patterns that were impossible to deny. Richard sat alone in his office late that night, reading every page carefully. Each report painted a clearer picture. Daniels had a history: verbal abuse, intimidation, disrespect toward civilians, disrespect toward co-workers. Every incident had been minimized, excused, buried. Richard leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. This was exactly what he feared, and exactly why he came. Over the next few days, internal affairs interviews began quietly. One by one, officers were called in. Some were nervous, some defensive, some relieved. A few officers spoke honestly for the first time in years. They talked about pressure to stay quiet, about being laughed at for raising concerns, about knowing certain behavior was wrong but feeling powerless to challenge it. Some admitted they had laughed along, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Richard listened without interrupting. He took notes. He asked questions calmly. He never raised his voice. Word spread quickly that things were different now. Not everyone welcomed it. One afternoon, an officer requested a private meeting. He sat stiffly across from Richard's desk, arms crossed. "Chief," the officer said, "some of us feel like morale is dropping." Richard nodded slowly. "Explain," he said. "It feels like we're walking on eggshells." The officer replied, "Like we can't joke anymore." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Did those jokes make us better at protecting this community?" The officer hesitated. "Or did they make certain people feel smaller?" Richard continued, "Less safe." The officer had no answer. "Respect is not the enemy of morale." Richard said calmly, "Abuse is." The officer left quietly. Not long after, Officer Daniels' investigation concluded. The findings were clear. His actions were not isolated. They were repeated, intentional, harmful. Richard signed the final report without hesitation. Daniels was terminated. The decision sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers were angry, others were relieved, a few finally felt seen. Richard addressed the department again that afternoon. His words were firm but measured. This decision was not personal. He said it was necessary. He made it clear that accountability applied to everyone. Rank would not protect misconduct. Silence would no longer be rewarded. Slowly, something began to shift. New training sessions were introduced, not just on procedure, but on communication and ethics. Officers were encouraged to speak openly. Complaints were reviewed seriously. Community meetings were scheduled regularly, and Richard attended every one. At the first town hall, residents sat stiffly, arms crossed, faces filled with doubt. Years of broken trust do not heal quickly. Richard stood at the front and spoke plainly. "I am not here to defend past mistakes," he said. "I am here to change what happens next." Some people listened, others remained skeptical. That was fine. Trust had to be earned. Weeks passed, then months. One afternoon, Richard walked through the station and noticed something small but important. An officer had pulled up a chair for an elderly woman at the front desk. He spoke to her patiently, listening carefully. When she smiled in relief, Richard felt a quiet sense of progress, not perfection, progress. Back in his office, Richard looked out the window toward the hills surrounding Blue Ridge. The work was exhausting, the resistance was real, but so was the change. His phone buzzed with a message from Captain Harris. "Chief, community feedback is improving." Richard smiled slightly. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be setbacks, there would be more uncomfortable truths, but the department was no longer pretending everything was fine, and that was the first real step forward. Richard turned back to his desk, steady and focused, knowing that real leadership was not about power. It was about courage, and he was just getting started.